I'm the Research Associate at the Institute of International Relations here at NCCU. We are part of an integral element with the NCCU since 1994. Before that, the Institute was partially affiliated with the NCCU between 1974 until 73. With the passage of the university law, that we became an integral part of the NCCU. Here, we witnessed the heydays of the Cold War era, and also for today, we're very, very grateful to rekindle our working relation with Harvard. Let me share with you a few seconds about our past engagement encounter with the Harvard fellow. Ian Johnson wrote his dissertation here. He stayed with us for a number of years. So that's the hallmark of our affiliation with Harvard. And also later, I think Bill Kirby.
Yeah, of course.
And also the, who else? Mafagwa.
Yeah.
I remember Professor Mafagwa was my discussant in one of the events here taking place in 1995. I still have a vivid memory about this. So the first and foremost, we'd like to rekindle our working relation with the Harvard faculties. Extremely delighted to invite Professor Saich and also Cunningham from Harvard at this time of year. And also the second logical or reason for our gathering today to celebrate it, the rise of China. We are the followers and audience of the syndrome that has been taking place already, attract a lot of attention of all walks of life, scholars in particular. And a couple of weeks ago, Professor Tom Go of Berkeley, who was here to share his frustration about the current status of China study at Berkeley, and we realized that probably we are facing a daunting challenge, and on one hand, the rise of China as a given, and also with the decline of the support of the university on the study of China. So it's a perplexing paradox. It's also invites all kinds of repercussions from within the discipline and also across the discipline. So today, as I said, we're not celebrating the China study, rather to focus on the current issue. Today's events consist of 3 legs. And the first leg, we are honored to have Professor Tony Saich from Harvard to give a talk on what does Xi Jinping dream about on the must-address issue. And I think the one way or the other, I just realized that the topic of the title of the talk has evolved into a different, way of addressing the issue. Let me followed by a second leg on the one Belt One Road, all right, under the aegis of Professor Xi Jinping. And the third leg will be having a roundtable with the various participation on the one by one road challenges. And that's a very, very important event for all of us to get together today to discuss, to share, to exchange notes on these challenges. And let me offer you some introduction about our speaker today. Professor Tony Saich, I just learned he visited here before as early as 1986. And he's currently a director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and Daewoo Professor of International Affairs, and teaching courses on comparative political institution, democratic governance, and transitional economy with a focus on China. In his capacity as the Ash Center director, Professor Saich also served as the director of the I don't know how to pronounce it, Wadi Foundation Institute for Asia, and the faculty chair of the China program, and the Asia Energy Leaders Program, and the Leadership Transformation in Indonesia program, which provide training program for national and local Chinese Indonesian officials. That's interesting. Professor Saich first visited China as a student in 1976. I believe that he belongs to the first wave of Western scholar conducted a PhD study when China opened its door, and continues to visit China each year. Currently, he is the guest professor of the School of Public Policy Management at the Tsinghua University of China. He also advised a wide range of government, private, non-profit organizations on work in China and elsewhere in Asia. His current research focus on politics and governance in post-Mao China, China's urbanization and rural urban inequality, and also the interplay between state and society in Asia, the respective role they play in the provision of public goods and the service at the local level. And his most recent publication books include Governance and the Politics of China 2015 version, which is the fourth. I believe there's the fifth already out.
I don't think so.
All right. It's a must-read textbook for all the students. China Village, Global Market, providing public goods in transnational China, revolutionary discourse in Mao's Republic, with David after the rise of China, the rise to power of the Chinese Communist Party, and China's science policy in the 80s. So it is a scholar with a very broad gauge, covering not only on China but also on entire, I shouldn't say entire, but mostly Asian region. So the Professor Saich holds a PhD from the Faculty of Letters, University of Leiden, Netherlands, and he received a master previously from London School, and is a bachelor's degree, and from University of Newcastle, UK. So this is a very important moment to have a scholar who has a very diverse background, and on the European perspective, and also on the North American perspective. So let's welcome Professor Saich.
So originally I was asked to talk, or I proposed talking about what does Xi Jinping dream about. And then just before I left Boston, I was asked if I could say a few things about One Belt, One Road. So I've tried to incorporate that into comments. So obviously what Xi Jinping has proved extremely skilled at is accumulating power and dominating the political discourse. And it seems to me that essentially when he took power in 2012, 2013, the situation was so severe that drastic measures were required, and politics had to take preference over economics. And of course, as you know, the core of that was the view that a disciplined, united party was crucial to push through the next phase of difficult reforms. So, at a simplistic level, of course, Xi's overriding objective is to maintain party rule. It was obviously put in place because people trusted him to take that on. But that simple assertion doesn't really tell us very much. So the question becomes, what is he going to do with that power? Carl Minzer wrote earlier that in 2012, politics appeared to be frozen, with economic and institutional reform seemingly frustrated by vested interests inside the Communist Party and outside, and of course local resistance to political liberalization. So I think what Xi has been trying to do is to find a new basis for the legitimacy of CCP rule, which is comprised both traditional and new elements. And he's actually broken away from the pattern that had developed previously, where senior party officials divided power amongst themselves, and the way they sought elite stability was through a rough balance of power between different groupings or factions. And of course, Xi has chosen to break away from norms and rules which had existed before. So, but the new leadership that is going to take over later this year is clearly going to set a set of daunting challenges to maintain stable economic growth and to cement China's position within the global and regional community. So domestically, of course, it needs to avoid falling into the middle income trap, a very popular topic of conversation in China these days. The Chinese leadership itself has said that the economic development model that has proved successful to date is no longer applicable moving forward. There needs to be a shift to consumer growth, consumer-led growth and higher quality production. As we're all aware, there's dealing with the severe pollution that has been a part and parcel of the reform. And while people focus on the question of air quality, I think even more important is the question of the water and soil pollution. And we see within China, having gone from 1978 being one of the more equal countries within the region now to being one of the most unequal globally. And those issues have caused periodic unrest, and certainly the pollution has been a growing concern to the growing urban middle class. And then when we add into that, integrating several 100 million migrants into new and old urban environments, there's a lot of domestic challenges, which I'll come back to. Externally, though, of course, there's also significant decisions that will define China's place in the world. Under President Trump, the US administration appears to be withdrawing from its previous role within the region, although responses to North Korea may alter that again, but also certainly on leadership around key issues such as climate change. So China's going to have to decide, does it or does it not want to move in to fill that leadership void, which is left by partial US retreat. And China, as you know, has always been saying we do not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. It's not been true, and it certainly will not be true in the future. And it's going to have to acknowledge its increasing economic power, and the associated influence means that it is involved in internal affairs of other countries. And as your topic this afternoon covers, that will increase with the Daiyilu, the One Belt One Road program, once that gets up and running, and of course the expansion of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. As I mentioned earlier, then of course there's the very specific challenges which come from the North Korea issue, the sovereignty claims around South China Seas, cross-straits relationship, and so forth. So I think in the run-up to the 19th Party Congress, there's four key elements that have really solidified Xi Jinping's preeminence in the system, and attest not only to his continuation as General Secretary, but also the fact that he's going to have a very strong say over appointments of members of the Politburo and its standing committee. I won't go through them in detail, but as you know, he's been defined as the core of the party leadership. One of the things I thought was very interesting was the second point, where in January of this year, they released comments that he made at the previous plenum of the party in October. And if you remember, when Ho Xilai was removed, and when Zhou Yongkang was removed, and when the military leaders were removed, it was said it was primarily related to corruption issues, misuse of power. I thought what was really instructive in the January comments was he actually moved beyond the earlier accusations that they were greedy financially, they were corrupt in their lifestyles, to say that in fact they had actually engaged in a political conspiracy against his rule. That to me really, the fact that they released that statement in January really said to me that he now feels very confident that he's got control over the party and that he's clearly the dominant figure. And that served as a warning to the others in the party who might think about challenging him. And as I said, it serves as an expression of his confidence, of the strength of his position. I won't go through the others. He was dominant, even though it's a state meeting, the last NPC meeting. And it looks pretty much certain that his four comprehensives is going to be included in the Constitution. if it rules for many more generations, they're going to have a very long preamble to the Constitution, as each leader has to have their own particular phrase in it. So he's clearly decided that for the party to remain in control, he has to get influence over the apparatus and be willing, as I said earlier, to prioritize political issues over continued restructuring of the economy. Ideally, I think he would have liked to have the anti-corruption campaign and economic reform go hand in hand, but that has not been the case. But clearing up the image of the CCP was crucial if the party wanted to retain its grip on power. And they centralized power, as most people have pointed out, as far as possible. That has advantages. He doesn't trust government, he doesn't trust society to carry out the reforms, but it also has drawbacks. I'm sure you hear from colleagues or business people trying to work in China that it's now very difficult to get decisions from local governments about investment or other areas, basically because in an environment of uncertainty such as the current one, it's really better to do nothing and keep your head down rather than take any decisive action. So what I thought I'd do is look at political priorities, economic priorities, and his international priorities briefly, and they make some kind of assessment of how successful those might be. Essentially, these are the 6 priorities that I see in terms of his political agenda. And this is the first one, in terms of the promotion of traditional Chinese culture. As was just mentioned, I was actually a student in China at the back end of the Cultural Revolution. So seeing now the promotion of Confucius by the Chinese Communist Party, having been a student during PDP called and criticized Lin Biao and Confucius, is quite extraordinary to me. I think it does have one significant element which is related to Taiwan, because if you think about the Chinese Communist Party, the source of its legitimacy was it was the break with the Chinese tradition. That the rise to power of the Communist Party was that break. Tradition moved to Taiwan with the Kuomintang. And of course the Kuomintang continued to stress that we represent what was best in Chinese traditional culture, political, and in other ways. So, with the Tokugawa decay in China, the lingering influence of what is termed Western liberal values, they turned to this selective interpretation of traditional culture. Now, obviously, it's a caricature of Confucianism. But I think, as I said, it's both tried to bolster an underlying appeal to socialism and to portray the Communist Party, not the Kuomintang, as the genuine inheritors of the imperial past. As Xi himself has said, the Chinese Communist Party is a successor to and promoter of fine traditional Chinese culture. That is actually quite an extraordinary shift, as I said, because traditionally they've emphasized they were the break with Chinese culture, not the continuity. Now, it's perhaps less relevant when the Minjindang, the DPP, is in power, because that reflects also more the indigenization of Taiwan and the relationship to Taiwan itself. But it will make an interesting split over time, where people in Taiwan begin to identify more with Taiwan, and the mainland itself, under the Communist Party, is saying that we are the inheritors of the Chinese tradition. But of course, that doesn't mean Marxism has been forgotten. They can't dispense with that, whether they like it or not. They're stuck with study of Marxism as an important part of the legitimacy to rule, and that's been emphasized by President or General Secretary Xi on a number of times. The third thing, which has been most remarkable, of course, has been the movement for officials to practice more frugal behavior, encapsulated in the slogan, 4 dishes and a soup. So, very good for people like me who are trying to lose weight. I don't have to sit through the banquets on the left any longer, and I can enjoy some local baozi in the local restaurants and not have to worry so much about my waistline. And of course, combined with that, there's things on what you should drink, less of the baotai, more of good, healthy water, and of course, under no circumstances should you be drinking rumi matin. And as you will have noticed, when this anti-corruption campaign came into effect, the shares on the global market of rumi matin dropped quite significantly, 10 or 15% or whatever, which shows perhaps some of the impact. But of course the other part, combined with this more frugal living, which is part of trying to regain confidence from Chinese people because of the extravagant living of officials, but it's also related to the questions of corruption within the Chinese Communist Party, which he calls tigers and flies. I think that one of the interesting things here is that we've seen the shift actually taking place before Xi Jinping, although the severity of his campaign is much stronger. With the decline in the relevance of ideology, you can't really use ideology to remove your political opponents any longer. You know, when I was a student in China, I learned the 十条路线斗争, the 10-line struggle. So everybody was a right deviationist, a left deviationist, or a right opportunist. That language became kind of nonsense by the 1990s. So when you see Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, when they removed their main opponents, it was done with a claim against corruption, not a claim that ideologically they deviated from the correct Communist Party line. And certainly Xi Jinping inherited that when he initially removed Bo Xilai and when he went after Zhou Yongkang. So in a sense, in a party struggle, the weapon of choice has now become that of corruption and attacks on corruption. So one of the other things that has been very important in his views has been that as a child of one of the founders of the People's Republic of China, he's been very proud of the achievements of the Chinese Communist Party. And as you will see, he's tried to break up this discourse that was emerging of one Communist Party up until 1978 and another Communist Party that opened up the system after 1978. And has tried to draw back more continuity into that history, which of course has led to repression of writings about things such as the Great Leap Forward. Writing about the Cultural Revolution was always repressed, but that has become even stronger in terms of that. And a number of attacks have been made, both on domestic and international historians who promoted what they refer to as historical nihilism, and those who haven't followed the official account of Chinese party history. Then going beyond that, there have been greater attempts to exert greater control over society to restrict the extent of international criticism. Does anybody know what that is on the left? What it is? It's Jello. Jello. It's you mix it up with hot water and you make sort of a jelly drink. The reason I put it there was because when President Clinton became president, one of his first comments was about the internet. And he said, you cannot nail Jello to the wall. And controlling the internet is like trying to nail Jello to the wall. Well, I've shown you can do it. And so can the Chinese Communist Party in terms of the restricting the extent of intellectual criticism and the attacks on Western theories and ideas. And you will all have seen the April 2013 internal document that talked about criticizing a range of ideas: constitutional democracy, universal values, neoliberalism, historical nihilism, and so forth. And I think the party's been trying to exert a stronger control over society and the state as is feasible. And I think what has been most interesting is the recent attempts to reassert control over those newer areas of development within society that didn't really have a structure for control in the traditional mechanisms. And what I mean by that, for example, is a non-governmental organization sector where we've seen regulations coming in to control that, tighter control around international NGOs working in that sector, reassertion of control over the private sector of industry in China, reasserting the need that there must be a party committee within private enterprises. And I think, as I'll come back to later, the reassertion of the primacy of the state within the economy over the development of the private sector. And of course, we've seen that also with tightening the control around new social media, the persecution of human rights lawyer, and so on, his visits to, Xi Jinping's visits to the media, where he said they had to pledge absolute loyalty to the CCP and follow its leadership in thought, politics and action. And the same for the comments around universities and what the kinds of students universities are meant to be turning out as a time. And I think what was interesting with the new charity law, which came in China, is that it marks the acceptance by the party that private wealth exists. For a long time, I think it wasn't sure how to deal with private wealth and its emergence. And there were a lot of barriers towards philanthropic giving and setting up charitable organizations. So I think at the first level, the parties accepted that wealth is there. And what the charity law actually does is try and make sure that wealth goes to the priorities that the party lays down itself. So it sets categories of what you can invest in. If you want to raise funds from the public, you have to get a special permit and so on and so forth. And I just found this as a response to what one Chinese citizen felt about party policies towards expression within society. And then, of course, as you felt most strongly and most recently with the question of Panama, the promotion of nationalism has accompanied that revival of traditional culture to bolster regime legitimacy. I think one of the other things, in addition to the more obvious factors of the assertive posture both towards Taiwan but also within the South China Seas, has been the attempt by the party to identify the nation with the party, so they're indivisible. And that makes any criticism of party policy unpatriotic, more than just a critical view of the party itself. So let me turn to some of the questions of the economic priorities and the international before I make some kind of general assessment of these. As I said earlier, it's very clear, I think both US analysis and Chinese analysis share essentially the same view, that the model that has worked in the past is not going to be appropriate for China moving forward. Liu Shijin, a former vice minister of the DRC, said quite bluntly, the end has come to the period of purely quantitative expansion and of extensive cultivation for meager returns. Xi Jinping himself has also criticized where they are with the current policy and the need to make structural adjustment moving forward. Now, the new economic priorities, as you know, were laid out most clearly in December 2013 at the third plenum with a very extensive document that had 60 priorities. I teach in a public policy school at Harvard, and one of the things we say is never have 60 priorities because, you know, that's a recipe for disaster. Focus on 2 or 3 things that you can really do. Of course, you have 60 priorities, people pick and choose the ones they want to concentrate on and ignore perhaps the ones that really you wanted to push ahead with. But I think there's 2 interesting points I would raise about the document from the third plenum. The first is, if you look at the priorities, they're identical to the priorities of Hu Jintao and Jia Bao in 2002-2003. That indicates to me just how difficult it is to make and push through those major policy shifts and structural changes. The second is, I think those outside of China, perhaps not in Taiwan, but certainly those in Europe and in America, tended to be bedazzled by the focus on the role of the market within the document, and also the Premier's comments about what the market could do for moving the economy forward. But I think what that led us to miss is a couple of things. I think when the Chinese officials use the word market, they don't have the same meaning that it would mean for, say, an American official, or someone thinking about the American market in the West. The other point is, when I reread the document more recently, there is still a very clear emphasis on the role of state-owned enterprises and state engagement in economic development. And certainly, the leadership has developed an industrial policy. That policy is designed to ensure the party retains control over key sectors of the domestic economy, as I'll come back to later, also to ensure greater influence over investment outside of China. So I think when we looked at that document, I think a lot of people misread it. And now were kind of surprised that, oh, you know, he still has this very statist view that state-owned enterprises are still playing that strong role. If you read the document, it's still there. It's still there. Also, of course, further strengthening the role of the state sector in the economy was the launch of indigenous innovation to focus on a range of industries, new energy vehicles, high-end equipment manufacturing, etc., which would be the driving force in the economy. I think also those industries and pillars, as they're defined, are part and parcel of the going out strategy that was to increase overseas investment and the expansion of the globalization of Chinese enterprises. And I think what has been made very clear through One Belt, One Road, and I'll come back to that in more detail, is that the state clearly intends to play a major role in Chinese overseas investment and to control more effectively the buying spree and mergers and acquisitions of recent years. The fact that the state intends to play that more active role is there, of course, with the establishment of the Infrastructure Bank and the Yidai program itself. So those projects are clearly to promote China's international interests, and they will favor major state-owned enterprises. And of course, one of the major priorities is to enable them to export excess capacity. So where are the priorities in his dream with economic policy? Well, as we know, what was referred to as the new normal, the slower, more balanced growth, the 9–10% has gone. 6–6.5% is what they're aiming for now. And the main elements, well, it also has the bizarre term of supply-side economic or structural reform. I still can't work out really what that actually means. It certainly doesn't mean what Ronald Reagan did when he talked about this as a measure. But as far as I can figure, it's cutting excess capacity, especially in steel production, closing down some of what they call the zombie state-owned enterprises, but at the same time subsidizing a small number of favored and often inefficient enterprises, tax breaks for some of the new industries I talked about, the electric vehicles, eco-friendly agriculture. And again, I think it reflects Xi Jinping's push for a stronger central control by the party over the economy. As I said, shifting to consumption now as the key driver of economic growth, which also by its nature will mean lower growth rates moving forward. And then thirdly, yes, the more judicial use of market forces to allocate resources and capital. They talked about the prices of water, oil, gas, electricity, all being set by the market. But if you look at what has been happening, the NDRC, the Development Reform Commission, actually reasserted production targets for key products. And in May, just this year, central authorities again announced they would move towards market pricing for oil and gas, which really reveals that since 2013, really no progress had been made. Reform of the state sector was to be strengthened, but in terms of market pricing, what was interesting was that decision made no mention of breaking up the SOE monopolies that dominate those sectors. And in fact, the idea of having competition within different sectors, again, has actually stalled. So subsequent reforms have not progressed far, and the political power, as we know, amongst that sector remains very strong. And again, I think if you say state-owned enterprise reform to an American, it means something very different, again, from what the Communist Party leaders mean. They don't mean it's going to be large-scale privatization. They don't mean it's going to be liberalization, but rather to allow them to contribute to the Communist Party's political standing more effectively. And the last was the emphasis on financial sector reform. I think what is interesting there is that many of the key leaders from Zhu Rongji's team were actually kept in place, with the notable exception of Lou Jiwei, who was moved out as Minister of Finance in November last year. So I think that is one area where they might be able to drive reforms, not just in terms of ensuring macroeconomic stability, but also promoting other reforms through the real economy. Interest rate liberalization is being pursued. Other reforms were intended to move capital to the non-state sector, where they might get higher returns. As we know, renminbi for trade settlements is becoming increasingly popular, but internationalization of the currency, of course, remains a long way off. And I was reading something by a financial expert who talked about what would the desired sequencing be for financial sector reform. If you look at it, though, what they've really talked about are renminbi internationalization and the kind of thing that would come at the end. Because politically, this sequence is just very, very difficult to clean up the too big to fail state-owned banks. So in as far as they've been talking about this, they've kind of flipped what would be the desirable measures to carry out. There's obviously going to be challenges between sustaining economic growth and the environmental degradation. So let me say a few words about the outward orientation, and I'll try and roll in some comments here about One Belt, One Road with this. Of course, China's economic rise is changing and will continue to change geopolitics. And we're seeing, obviously, a divergence in the US about how to deal with that. The report by Bob Blackwell and Telus, for example, last year, essentially takes the starting point that America has facilitated the integration of China into the global economy and therefore has facilitated its economic rise to the point where it is now a threat to US interests within the region and also globally. And now perhaps the US needs to move towards constraining and checking that development of the economy. Others still think engagement is the way to go. But I think there's two things I would mention. The first is, if you read many of the Chinese economists, they're far less positive about China's economic trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years. If you contrast that when you read the IR theorists and those from the military, they're very bullish. You know, China's on the rise, China's growing, America's in decline, this is China's moment. I mean, it's almost as if they're not reading what their own economists are saying about the potential problems with the economy. And if the economists are correct, with the exception of Ni Fu, it does set constraints about what and how much power China might be able to project militarily outside. As I said, we're also seeing a divergence of how one would accommodate that economic rise amongst experts writing on this within the US. And I think one of the end results of what we're seeing is a potentially dangerous diversion between an economic Asia that China is increasingly trying to place itself at the core of, the One Belt, One Road, the investments, so on and so forth. And a security Asia, because of China's aggressive moves within the region and the South China Seas, a security Asia within which people still look to America to play a kind of core role within that. So that's, and of course, President Trump's decision to abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership has really severed a potential link between the two. You know, what would have been in the US interest was to forge a commonality between the trade and investment relations with Asia and the security component. And, you know, the ex-Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who's on his way back to the Kennedy School, he said, you know, that's worth an extra battleship to me when he was Secretary of Defense. That is now gone, so that has to be seen how that will be dealt with. But powerful countries, of course, shape the world, and whether we like it or they like it or not, China's leaders are going to be forced to take a more proactive stance, not just on questions of territorial sovereignty, but also on ones of reserve currencies, banking and financial regulations, trade and investment agreements, climate discussions, provision of global public goods, etc. And I think that's going to present a huge challenge to the leadership in Beijing, because they don't have much experience in negotiations in many of those areas. They're actually very thin in many of these areas. So they'll have to come to terms with the fact that the country is a major player, and the global community is going to expect a clearer explanation of China's policy intent. I won't go into it in detail, but as you know, it's quite obvious. Xi Jinping has become more positive in terms of China's role. He's called for China playing a much more important role in global economic regulation. I think Deng Xiaoping's saying of hiding one's capability, biding one's time, has really gone. And they've suggested a much more aggressive role in international affairs. I think it's strange that I see in the Western press that we see the president of China, after Davos, as one of the promoters now, as a firmest defender of economic globalization. Not surprising, because China, of course, has been one of the major beneficiaries of that. But I think you need to be seen and need to see what is actually taking place rather than what is being said in that framework. They've also talked about a new type of great power relationship to dictate relations of the United States to America. Again, something that was not accepted by the Obama administration, and who knows what President Trump has accepted. But I think for here, what I think is interesting is that rather than what I call a pirouette that the Obama administration talked about, rather than a pivot, I think China really has refocused policy emphasis on the Asia region. Previously, even though many of its interests were in the Asia region, it didn't really think coherently about Asia as a whole. And I think from 2013, Foreign Minister Wang Yi signaled a shift that indicated more attention would be paid to the Asia region. And then, of course, it was, I think, Yang Jiechi in Singapore, warned Singapore, we're a big country, you're a small country, people follow big countries. So it has entailed carrots and sticks. And the carrot, of course, is a range of investments that China has been pushing in the region, the OBOR projects, establishment of the AIB, but it does provide opportunities to tie nations throughout the region into China's sphere of influence. And of course, the stick relates to questions of sovereignty and China's more aggressive moves in the South China, East China Seas, and also related to actions against Taiwan. And that causes the tightening of security relations with the US. So, as I said, Xi Jinping has talked about a new round of opening to the world, that it should play a stronger role in global economic organization. He said we cannot be a bystander, but must be a participant, a leader. I think two questions arise from that. First, what might change if China writes more of the rules of the global economic order? And secondly, what is the intention of One Belt, One Road, and what are the challenges? So I think if we think about US regulations related to trade liberalization issues, I think there's two key characteristics. Now, we can certainly say, President Trump is unpredictable, liable to shift his mind, but when it comes to actual agreements, on the whole, the characteristic of US economic liberalization is that of predictability. And the reason I say that is because all the trade agreements have to go through Congress. And once they go through Congress, it's an intense period of bartering and argument and agreement, which tends to mean they almost come out with cookie cutter type structures. So you know that a free trade agreement has a set template. It has tariff reductions, services liberalizations, rules on investment, government procurement, intellectual property rights, protection for labor and the environment. Also, secondly, even though America might not always follow them, there's an emphasis on rules and transparency, with terms of engagement set out well in advance and clarified over many rounds of domestic and international negotiations. By contrast, if you look at two key features of Chinese economic liberalization, I think the first thing is, if you look at Chinese trade agreements, they vary very extensively. The agreements aren't the same country to country. So just if you compare, for example, the trade agreement with Singapore, with Chile, with Peru, they're all very different. So each one is really tailored to specific priorities and specific aspects of the politics between both countries. The second, as you know, they're always lacking in detail. Very typical process is that you set out broad policy objectives and then they get filled in as you progress and go along, which is always what frustrates American lawyers, of course, who want everything defined and set front up. Well, I'm sure it garners them a lot of fees as they go through the process. So, One Belt, One Road. I was asked to make a few comments on this. I defy anybody to tell me what it means. I have no idea, really, what One Belt, One Road means. It is certainly one of Xi Jinping's highest priorities, there's no doubt about that, but it's not clear what exactly it entails. It's not clear what is the geographic area for it. It's also unclear about the financing. What is the role of the Silk Road Fund? What is the role of AIIB? Most of the funding currently still comes through the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank. And also virtually every province in China now has its own One Belt, One Road plan. And of course, much of which existed before and has been repackaged essentially to get more money from the central government. So what that means is substantial interests are going to shape One Belt, One Road as it actually unfolds. Anbang, not the most favourite company in China at the moment, but in April 2017, Anbang in a report noted that One Belt, One Road was originally restricted to the new Silk Road, focused on infrastructure in Central Asia. But then the coastal provinces pushed back against that, found that unacceptable, and lobbied to expand the scope to bring in the maritime component. Now, the centre, One Belt, One Road, is driven by three conflicting agencies: the National Development Reform Commission, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Commerce. Those three have quite different objectives. You know, NDRC is still very much part of the control of the state over this process. The Ministry of Commerce tends to be the most friendly towards global regulations, including adoption of WTO norms and practices. And of course, the Ministry of Finance want to ensure there's fiscal prudence. So they're very different priorities, as do the subnational units that they will pursue under One Belt, One Road. And in fact, currently, most lending from China outside its borders does not go to One Belt, One Road countries. The main destinations are still Europe, the US, Australia, and Canada. And David Dollar, in a report he wrote in May this year, he said that being along the Belt and Road has not resulted in more investment than is received by other parts of the developing world. However, he does raise one important point, which goes back to something I said earlier, that China is less risk averse than Western investors. So with Xi Jinping now seeing this as his key project and his prestige at stake, it does mean that with the state reasserting control over large outbound investments, you might see much more riskier investments moving forward. So clearly, there's a set of geopolitical component. Justin Lin, who I mentioned earlier, already in 2015, he pointed out that Xi Jinping had launched OBOR to counterbalance US policies such as the pivot and TPP. Peter Saich, in an interesting paper recently, talked about an economic rationale, what he called geoeconomics, of the One Belt, One Road. One thing is, it's clearly seen as a key part of China's regional development plans that are directed to dealing with the significant regional inequalities in China, because the provinces like Xinjiang, Yunnan were seen to be drivers benefiting from the One Belt, One Road policies. And certainly Xinjiang, for example, was seen to be core in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is estimated to be, 45, 46 billion. Secondly, what is more commonly noted, of course, is that it's to help to deal with the enormous excess capacity that was created in major part because of the stimulus package after the financial crisis, to help export industrial products, excess industrial products, but also it's going to entail moving excess production capacity out of China. It's going to migrate whole production facilities. Li Keqiang in Myanmar recently made this very clear. Thirdly, I think they see it as a way to upgrade their own industry and export Chinese standards as a part of the Made in China 2025 strategy. I think, rightly or wrongly, I don't know enough about the details of standard setting, but I think when they look at when Europe was dominant and when America was dominant, they tended to set global standards in different industries. And so I think with high-speed rail and a number of other things, China's hoping that will do that to get them the first mover advantage and help them push up the production scale. And the challenges are obviously fairly obvious. Is there enough projects to go around? Speaking to people privately from commercial banks, they're worried about the risks and finding enough profitable projects. So are there enough decent projects to go around? Will it worsen China's debt problem, or will they be pushed into higher risk products? This is highlighted by the fact that, of course, a large number of One Belt, One Road countries have a sovereign credit rating well below investable grade, and some only at junk level. And we've seen problems, of course, with repayments in Africa and other places where China's engaged in these kinds of projects. Thirdly, the other thing is, in addition to the instability of some of these countries, China's moving into very tricky geopolitical environments. Investments in Pakistan disturb India, that makes India start talking more to Japan. Is Russia likely to accept Chinese dominance in what it sees as its own backyard and sphere of influence? And of course, as we've seen sadly, the killing of Chinese workers and capture, kidnap of Chinese workers, attacks on Chinese installations is liable to increase in a number of these environments. Very briefly on trade, a number of people have said that RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, will take over dominating the norms for trade and investment. I think given time, I don't really have time to go into that, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. So let me conclude about whether he'll realize his dream or not. In favour, of course, he's a much stronger leader and much more confident than Hu Jintao. He's created a vehicle to push through the reforms with the Central Leading Group for comprehensively developing reforms, which is set up all the way through. But there's a number of barriers. First of all, as I said, are there too many priorities? Secondly, can they meet this trade-off between economic growth and environmental degradation? But I think thirdly, and most importantly, the reforms have really produced strong vested interests that are favoured by the status quo, which is why his agenda in 2012-2013 looks so similar to the agenda of Hu Jintao and Jiabao in 2002-2003. The state-owned sector, officials, families, all have vested interest in the status quo. I think if you compare it to the big pushes in the 90s, it's more difficult to see where support comes from. In the 80s, you had a world coming out of the Cultural Revolution, you had a fusion between senior officials and bottom-up pressure to push through some of the reforms. In the 90s, after Deng Xiaoping went down to Shenzhen, you saw, again, a lot of officials, a lot of military people were going to clearly benefit from pushing ahead with those reforms. After WTO entry, you see this huge boom, obviously, in the private sector and elsewhere, but it's hard to see who is going to come as a coalition around Xi to really push through these reforms. Just very briefly, as I said, the proposed economic reforms will damage those vested interests. Who would he rely on? Well, local government officials. But will local government officials do anything? Because they're kind of paralyzed by the anti-corruption campaigns of which they are a target. So in a sense, he really has to get people to sign on to the fact that if not us, if we don't do this, then perhaps we all go under. Well, my response to that might be, well, let me get as money out of this system while it's still there before it does go under, rather than change it. And I think, as Larry Summers, my colleague, always says, look where the money goes. And when people have the opportunity, the money goes out of China. It doesn't stay in China, which Larry sees as very telling. There are also external barriers, of course. It depends not only on the general health of the global economy, but also how countries in the region, the major trading partners, are going to interpret China's growth. It'd be interesting for you, obviously, this afternoon in the sense of how is OBOR seen, how are Chinese companies going global seen. There's going to be currency disputes, there's going to be trade disputes. So what about in the economy? Lo Jiwei talked about a 50-50 chance of sliding into the middle income trap. That's not surprisingly, therefore, he's no longer Minister of Finance. But the one question is whether there is a relationship to the quality of institutions. And I just put this chart together, mapping out income per capita with aggregating the 6 indicators that the World Bank uses for good governance. And you see Taiwan, South Korea have tended, Malaysia even, have tended to move out of that middle income trap, and they have much better governance indicators. Now, you can argue with me causality. I mean, is it because they moved ahead economically, they now have better institutions or not? But China is struggling still in that stuck area with rising level of income, but still poor levels of government indicators. So to come back to this question, I think if you look at a lot of writing now, the success of South Korea and also Taiwan is no longer attributed to the absence of state regulations and interventions. Rather now, most of the writers say it's the specific nature of the regulations and interventions, that indeed there was a high degree of state intervention, but it was to provide a policy framework for competition, growth and export. So I think the question then really arises, does China have the institutions that can make that same kind of, or build the same kind of institutions for constraint on irrational, ineffective and corrupt behavior? Again, David Dollar, he claims that there's a strong empirical relationship between the quality of institutions and economic growth. And I just showed you a chart I mapped based on that idea. So I think Vietnam and China have good institutions for their current level of growth. And that's why they're able to attract very high levels of foreign direct investment. Authoritarian institutions for countries that have per capita income below about $8,000 do seem more conducive to growth, the way they control, the way they direct. But what you see once you get to higher levels of income, that's not so clearly the case any longer. And I think it's because at that point, you need political and economic institutions that promote competition, that promote innovation, and promote productivity growth, rather than acquiring increasing amounts of capital, which China's been very good at to date. So I think there's a question mark there. The other question mark is, of course, growth is going to slow, but the question is by how much? Now, obviously, with the 19th Party Congress coming up, Xi Jinping is not going to do anything that will slow the economy down, because he wants to get through the Party Congress. That means the problems are pushed down the road with the increased debt to GDP ratio rising further. And that, of course, has resulted in the continuation of the stimulus packages. This is taken from work by Dwight Perkins and Tom Roski that suggests that income level may be correlated to slowdown in the growth rates. So here, if you see the green ones, are where the period of high growth periods for the economies when they were over 5%. So we see where the initial takeoff is in Japan. It's from about 1960, Republic of Korea a little bit later, Taiwan also a little bit later, and then you see where it begins to hit the slowing in the growth rates. In Japan, 1971, Taiwan, as it goes into the 1990s, Korea, 92. The interesting thing to remark about that is that if you look at purchasing power parity GDP at slowdown, Japan was 13,800, Taiwan was 13,370, and Korea, remarkably, was also 13,370. So that's kind of an interesting figure. Once you get to a certain level of per capita income, is when the economies begin to slow. It's impossible to get back to those high growth rates. Do you know what currently China's figure is on that same PPP GDP per capita? Not a difficult question, given what I just said. It's 14,450. So China has really basically reached that point of slowdown, if Tom and Dwight are correct. But of course what you see is, why has it gone on so long in China? Well, it's not magic. It's not that China's done anything that much different. You know, it started much later because of holding back reforms, and it started at a much lower base than did other countries within the region. But even if China grows at 6.5%, which I think is actually debatable, but if it does grow at 6.5%, the additional GDP is 80% of Indonesia's current GDP, or 1/3 of India's. So it's still going to be important. So, sorry, this is just a chart showing when the slowdown actually occurred. So, demographic dividends, and I am getting near the end, I promise you, propelled China through the 80s, the 90s, and the first decade of this century. But labour is now at its largest size, and of course, as we know, it's poised to shrink. So over the last decade, capital and formation-powered investment-led growth, but now we're seeing diminishing returns in many of the overcapacity sectors. So Dan Rosen actually put forward different scenarios. I reworked them a little bit, but I essentially agree with Dan Rosen and his Rhodium Group report and analysis. They calculate that by 2020, there is a potential to hit 6% growth, but half of that growth would have to be generated through continued investment in the country's capital stock. Okay, what's the problem there? It can't be allocated in the way it is at the moment to the inefficient state-owned enterprises, many of which are losing money. It has to really go through to reallocate it onto different assets or different classes of assets than is the case today. And you might get 3% growth out of that. The other half, though, really needs to come from more efficient and productive use of China's finite, as I said, declining human resources and capital, TFP, essentially. But that, again, requires new rules and institutions to let the markets work better, to steer resources to where they can generate higher growth. Let me just say one footnote on this. I was always puzzled when Xi Jinping moved to Beijing. You know, given that he'd worked in Zhejiang, Fujian, a lot of people thought he was very sympathetic to private enterprise growth. So I was talking to some friends in Shanghai, and they were saying, yeah, when he came into Shanghai, he was much more positive about the private sector. But his experiences in Shanghai and the way that Shanghai uses its state-owned capacities to support its own development and its own priorities, he found extremely persuasive. So that when he went to Beijing, he went with a much more positive view in his mind of the way the state-owned sector could be used to support the party and promote growth. So secondly, if you don't get better improvements in total factor productivity, and you're really only relying on investment, then you're looking at growth in the 3 to 4% range rather than the 6-7% range. And of course, the worst of all is that if those investments are poorly used as falling productivity, TFP doesn't improve, and with the restrictions taking place now around private investment, you could hit a much lower growth rate. I'm not sure that I would agree with Dan that it could go down to 1%, but there's a real danger there. I mean, if you think about it, even with its state investment, if you're going to urbanize another 300 million people, there's got to be growth in there somewhere. It might not be great growth, might not be good growth, but the figures will still show growth. And despite all the infrastructure building, per capita, China is still underserved in terms of infrastructure capabilities. So even there, from a state directive, you know, you could get below the 1-2% lower range for that. So I think what I've suggested is that Xi's dream faces significant challenges on all three fronts, politics, economics, and international. But let's bear in mind it's been successful before when faced by different circumstances. Let's read back to my colleagues what they said in the 80s, the 90s, the last 10 years, the world's coming off the wagon, China will never get through this phase of reform. It always has done. But I do think it's true to say that the easy parts of reform are being done, and now the most difficult elements are there to be reformed that touch most closely on the core of party power. What is the likely outcome? I could say I won't tell you, and we can leave it to questions, but a democratic outcome along the lines of Taiwan, South Korea, I think is extremely unlikely. What I see as most likely is some variant on a Putin-esque, Putin-type scenario. Because what you have in China are essentially an elite that are globally engaged and making money out of global engagement, that feel very threatened and very worried about an underclass. And I think the idea of them wanting to keep stability and using the security forces and the military to entertain that, I think is quite a feasible outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for Professor Saich's detailed depiction and debunking of the rise of China from multifaceted analytical perspective. Before we move on to the Q&A, I'll ask our audience to introduce themselves briefly.
My name is Tang Shaocheng. My background is Germany, and my expertise is now on the cross-strait issues.
Great.
I'm Lin Yixiang, a former legislator, and I major in Asian studies.
I'm Jason Guo. I'm from Georgetown.
My name is Dimitri Gormidis. I'm research associate from the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy.
Okay. But are you based here or are you based in Greece?
In Athens.
In Athens.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Francis Green. I'm the high school teacher from Nationwide Commercial High School.
Hello, my name is Josie Marie Perkun. I'm a PhD candidate from Heidelberg University, staying here with fellowship at the Produce2017062301.
Are you with Susanna?
No, actually it's Domina Youngster, so they are living together.
Oh.
It's Huang Chung, so she talks later.
My name is Jun Mo from Korea. I'm a visiting scholar. I'm studying in NTU. Nice to meet you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Henry. Right now I'm assumed to work here for the MAC. Also I'm a business guy.
Hi, my name is Liu Wu. I'm associate professor in College of Social Science and National Zhengzhi University, as well as associate research fellow in Institute of International Education.
Hello, everyone. And my name is Sophia. I'm a pianist.
Yes.
Nice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liu Yanping. I'm a student in political science in National University.
Hello, Professor. I'm Chen Xianwu. I'm from National Zhengzhi University. I'm a master student focused on development studies.
Hello, Professor. To speech, my name is Domingo Yap. I'm a PhD candidate from the NCC.
Hello everyone, my name is Alf. I'm a master student in NCC, major from business.
everyone. My name is Huang Wei. I'm a major in international politics, and I'm a teacher of Mr. Yuan. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Olga. I'm from Russia, but I'm based in Taiwan. It's CCU, and PhD candidate.
Good morning, Professor. I'm Jason Lee, and I'm from Department of Diplomacy in NCC. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Arash. I'm from Iran, Tehran University. I'm a PhD candidate of political science at the Tehran University and visiting a scholar at the NCCU. Thank you.
Great.
Hello everyone, I'm Lin Wanpi. I'm currently a PhD student from NTU. I'm working on the discourse of Chinese IR scholars, such as Yan Xuetong and Qin Yajing. Yeah.
Another well.
Hi, I'm Nin Zhongquan from Academia Sinica. Actually, I have one question and one comment.
We got time.
Hi everyone, my name is Dalton. Dalton Ling. I'm a assistant professor from Tech.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a student at Produce School of Business at Indiana University.
Okay.
Well, I'm Donald Ho. I'm a professor of pathologist. I'm interested in China. And today, actually, I accompany my wife to attend.
Hi, my name is Xu Fanhong. I'm an assistant research fellow in IIR. I do some research in China and the US individual trade.
And Xu I'm from Nanhai University and PhD from Education.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia, and I'm a student from Saich University.
Sorry, what? From where?
Saich.
Oh,
Another
yeah.
And I'm very interested about Chinese studies. That's the reason why I enjoy it. Yeah.
Everybody, my name is Hu Junye. I'm a PhD student from BCC in Zhongguo Dashi.
Thanks. I'm Ray Wong. I'm assistant research fellow at IIR.
All right. The floor is open. Okay, you go first.
Okay. Thank you for your comprehensive and informative speech. I have one question and one comment. First, since you're interested, you mentioned Russian President Putin. And what exactly Xi Jinping dreamed about in terms of his consolidation of power? Do you think he is pursuing the long-term standing of the CCP or the long-term standing of his own power? And my comment is, I don't think every Chinese IR theorist or IR scholar are all bullish in terms of Chinese foreign policy. Because I know some are more are very cautious and prudent, and I think there is a emerging debate among Chinese scholars over the issue of overextension of the Chinese foreign policy. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right on the second point. I made it more, I think, to show that there is a distinction as compared to those working on IR. And I think, I was thinking mainly in the IR, those coming through some of the military think tanks and some of the others. But certainly, yeah, a number of people like Wen Jise, for example, and others I know, are very disturbed about the over-projection of China's capabilities. And that it's, so I think you're right, and I would agree with you that probably it's something which is increasing over the last year or two, more of a discussion coming out into the public. And, you know, it's also has ramifications through diplomacy because, you know, speaking to a number of people in the foreign ministry who also have been somewhat disconcerted by the actions in the South China Seas and other more aggressive actions, that felt it's undermining what was being portrayed as the win-win strategy in the region. And I don't know if you saw in the East Asia Forum towards the end of last year, Kishore Mahbubani's piece in that. And Kishore, who's the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, has always been very careful in his comments about mainland China and loves to be very critical about America. But he wrote a piece which really took me by surprise, in which he said along the lines of, China is trying to break ASEAN. It's really sacrificing its long-term interests for short-term interests, and is rapidly depreciating the capital that it's built up in the region over the last few years. And that to me was very surprising coming from someone like Kishore. So I think it speaks to the fact of what we're saying, that people are now beginning to see problems with an overextension and an overexertion. On the first question, I think probably Xi Jinping sees them as indivisible. What's good for Xi is good for the party. So, and of course, there's all these questions about, will he serve a third term or not? The answer is who on earth knows. Under the party constitution, there is no term limit. State constitution restricts him to 2 terms as president. Of course, it could be rewritten, but so he could easily stay on as general secretary beyond that, maybe step down for a term and come back for a term. And remember, before Jiang Zemin, the post of presidency was not seen as a very important, high-profile position. And it was really when Jiang Zemin wanted to go and shake hands with my queen in Britain that he realized the queen doesn't really like to shake hands with the heads of communist parties. And so I think there was a serious status issue that, would countries receive him as a general secretary, or what did they receive him as? And so it was part of that general reconsolidation of party and state power, which had been broken up before. So it could be finessed, potentially.
You. I agree with most of those things, and I like very much your presentation. I would put a finger on one thing, though. I hear that you say still ideology within politics matter, even though now the legit way of dealing with it is anti-corruption. However, if we see there's still ideology or ideologic tension and campaigning matters, I would like to see your perspective on how this war has an end game, or is there something? One thing is, I would say, we see economic value into the over-campaign towards the new West, but also I would say binding with the West means to integrate the Xinjiang or remote areas closer to Beijing, so that is pretty much, I don't know, we have this saying in German, with one clap hitting 2 flies, so integration and economic. Yeah, thank you. One stone, 2 birds or something?
It's the Dutch equivalent of German.
And so I wonder how much different that might be perceived under Xi Jinping, overstarted with Hu Jintao. But Xi Jinping clearly is making different aspects stronger or prioritize them, even though they stick to the 60, but I think there's an internal which says from within those 60, we prioritize those 5.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say they are too stupid to go into this disastrous scenario. So if they do this, one thing with the Xinjiang question, and the second one, is there an end game to building on Marxist area, would you say, an alternative order? Slowly, not like radical, as Mao would have done it, or well, Russia and under the Soviet Union would have done it. But clearly to say we are comfortable in 2 worlds and we give an alternative model to the world. If you follow us, well, then you will have our game.
Yeah, I think, let me come back to that in a moment. What I said about the question of ideology and corruption, what matters, was that because ideology had been really demoted as a political weapon, because no one, as you know as well as I do, very few people talk or believe in Marxism. When I got bored with conversations with local government officials, I would just say, well, how does Marxism fit in with this? Just to liven up the conversation, just to see how much they would choke before they could actually come up with some kind of an argument. So what I was saying was that, the substitution of corruption has become the main weapon of choice in inter-party battles because ideology has become redundant. What I then said, though, was that you can't ditch an ideological flag entirely, because why isn't it the party that happens to be good at developing economy and locking up dissidents party? I mean, a nationalist party, other parties could claim legitimacy. So it also has to, you can't sort of throw overboard, in that sense, 100% its ideological roots and linkages. What it does do, though, I think on the practical side, it does set constraints about how far you can remove with reforms. It's rather like, although obviously on different terrain, when in the UK, the Labour Party, we had debates for years over Clause 4, which was the nationalisation of key industries. And it was always felt that this is holding back the Labour Party from being able to expand its electoral base and so forth. And it was a legacy from the past that for a long time people clung on to. So I meant it more in that sense, that they can't just let ideology go entirely. The other consequence, I think, comes out of it, and I think this speaks to the problems where people in China talk about moral vacuums or belief, and a lot of young people are, moving towards Christianity. Traditional Chinese religion is becoming very popular again, because the state cannot lay down a sense of moral behavior for its citizens, because it's not the way people are living their lives. When I was younger, I used to go to East Germany, and you just saw that, the difference between the way kids were living their lives and what the party, Consul Youth, or whatever, was telling them about the way they should live. So people don't have, in a sense, kind of moral guidance about how to behave in society, because what the party talks about in its rhetoric doesn't bear resemblance to the life they're living, which is a much more brutal kind of early stage of capitalism. Where does this tie into then your questions? I agree with you that certainly the part of OBOR is to ensure integration of areas like Xinjiang, Tibet, others into one China. It's what I often say to Chinese colleagues is that they have this belief that those people are ungrateful. We give you this economic growth, we give you this growth, and you're still against us, is a refrain you often hear. When I grew up in the UK, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, was still very strong in Ireland. We had the bombing campaigns in London and so on and so forth. And I used to say to people there, economic growth alone doesn't override issues of identity and culture. And just sort of making Xinjiang wealthy is not going to make some of these issues go away. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I rather said, while giving those fence-sitters money or taking away potential allies of Xinjiang area to work with. So actually, the devious argument is, we take away your potential allies to bind them closer.
I see.
So
sorry.
you have no other choice as to feel free.
No, I think, no, sorry.
That's actually the point.
Sorry, on that, I agree with you 100%. 100%. But on the other point, I do think it's true that, Xinjiang, Southwest, to some extent Tibet, they have external points of reference. And yes, I think you're probably right, that that's what they're thinking. Let's take that away, and then they don't have that. I don't think there's an end game of trying to build a Marxist order. I mean, there is an end game of trying to build an order where China has a dominant role. And I think it does prove attractive to some countries. I mean, Thailand, currently, I think the generals quite like the idea of a more free-roaming economy with more of an authoritarian power. They already control Laos, Kampuchea. They put Myanmar into a very difficult position, essentially. So I think, an alternative order, but then you begin to question, what is it really that would be enduring and appealing to a range of countries that is from China? You know, actually, Yan Xuetong came and gave a talk in my class about soft power, and he was quite blunt. He said, "What soft power does China have? We don't have any. So how can we rely on soft power actually to promote our interests?" And I think, however cynical one might be about the US, there are things that appear attractive to people. And I'm not sure those attributes of China are enduring and attractive to a lot of nations. So I think it's certainly very difficult to do. And it's certainly not a Marxist.
Yeah, I appreciate your remarks. And I have several points to make. Firstly, China is an oxymoron and sui generis. So most of your perspectives is from the West. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say it lacks the Chinese original perspectives. This is the first point. And secondly, the One Belt One Road has a very important purpose to serve, namely the energy security. I don't think that you mentioned this. You mentioned the other things, but I think it's one of the most important things which has in mind of the Beijing leaders. And third point is, what's the U.S. stance on this One Belt One Road initiative? It is a kind of initiative for 30 years. So it is just in the making. What do you think that the President of the United States will take this as a challenge or as a what? What can you understand?
I would never try to understand anything that the current president is thinking. On your second question, it's good you just walked in when you did. My colleague, Edward, actually works on energy security, energy issues, and so forth. And he asked, because I didn't touch on that with Obor, the one prime objective of Obor is to ensure energy security. And what did I think of that?
Yeah, so I mean, the apologies for the call in the middle of our trials. I think that when you unpack Obor, there's sort of different levels, right? And so there's the overall label that is trying to mix political, economic, and security goals into one package. And a lot of that, as you rightly point out, is still very vague and is completely non-viable and is more of an approach to, I think, having some counterbalance to what was originally sort of TPP concept that was done by the United States, right? Sort of a counterweight concept. But when you start peeling away the different layers, I think of what looks like a monolithic thing, I think as you move from political to economic then to security, it becomes much more specific. And so whether it's, so when you look at energy security supply, diversification of the modes, so the modes in which energy is imported and the types of energy, right? So trying to diversify towards gas and away from oil, and also trying to increase pipeline versus maritime. I think you see quite clearly that there are certain pre-existing projects that are now called OBOR that are very specific and highly valid and already either under construction or completed that I think we should take very seriously. Right? So whether it's Myanmar, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan, those are all real in my mind. And whether you look at the consortia, the financial consortia and the industrial consortia, they've moved quickly and there's been major results. That, and the ability to remove some of the pressure on the maritime routes through those land approaches and relieve those routes by having a pipeline makes a lot of sense. And I I think it should be something that we all take quite seriously. On the flip side, trying to understand how OBOR is going to move at that rate for political and economic goals in places like Africa, I think is a completely different animal. Right? So we can't really analyze them on the same. I wouldn't analyze them using the same frameworks. And even if you look at Southeast Asia, you have to be, I think, quite careful how you approach it. So certain Philippines-related investments, for example, I think are quite real. For example, around ports, as opposed to looking at what they're trying to do to ramp up power production, which I think is going to be much harder for them to accomplish. Right. So that's at least how I would think about that.
Well, why don't I take your question, and maybe I can wrap.
I have a simple question. The question is that, well, like, in your talk you mentioned about like it's hard to identify what exactly is this coalition, right? But my question here is that because during your presentation you identified a few priorities there, and usually we know that the politicians, they propose policies to satisfy their constituencies, right? So I just wonder whether you can, through your analysis of these political economic priorities, whether you can use this to identify potential coalition from your analysis. This is the first question. And the second question is, it's more kind of like comment, not really a question. It's about like, so you mentioned about the One Belt, One Road, where the countries usually are sort of like really poor credit ratings. And it makes me to think about like an interesting recent event, which is, the Moody's downgrade Chinese sort of like ratings, right? But to counter that, the Chinese credit rating agencies actually try to sustain the rating of the Chinese government. It speaks to a very interesting set of questions here, is that usually in terms of the bond market, usually the Western credit rating agencies dominate the bond market. But now you have this set of non-Western credit rating agencies that produce a separate set of ratings, which to me may be a good thing, which is you open up the credit rating agency markets. It's no longer dominated by the Western credit rating agencies, right? And actually it's a problem of the global financial crisis, right? Which we don't really know about what's going on in Greece, right? So even though we look at the One Belt, One Road and all the sort of credit rating agencies, things sound like not really credible given the Western standards, but actually they produce a separate standard, and that relates to the point you mentioned about the sort of China emerges as a global standard setters, but maybe not directly set standards, but actually through these kind of state-funded agencies to produce a separate ratings and to structure how the expectations of the market or how others think about the world in China and the other countries, right? And I think that's an interesting point from the presentation tonight.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point, and I think it relates to the first question that you raised about not looking at this from Chinese original perspectives. That when you enter into their world, perspectives become very different. And I think, related to this question of ratings and credit, I would say there, obviously Western ratings agencies haven't done a very good job always, and they're very close. So in the same way that I don't think there's anything wrong with the Chinese One Belt, One Road program as a whole. I mean, there are huge infrastructure needs throughout the world, including in Boston. And, there's insufficient capital within the existing financial institutions and the West more broadly. So that, I think, is great that that's opening up, and I think that should be applauded. I do wonder, in a way, if Congress and President Obama had not blocked the expansion of Chinese capabilities within the IMF, whether they really would have gone and set up AI. It may be that they felt blocked with that, so therefore, well, let's just go ahead and do our own organization. There, I think there's going to be an interesting challenge, because if you look at the structure of the leadership of AIB, it's not totally run by the Communist Party. So I think you argue there's tension between financially viable investments and those which are more politically inspired, which is why I think things like the China Development Bank and the Export and Import Bank are going to continue playing a major role, because they will have more of the political pressure on them. And on the new rating agencies, yeah, why not? And let's see. I mean, if they give, you know, AAA plus ratings to a bunch of stands and it doesn't work out, well, you know, credibility will come in pretty quickly. I think on the other, the coalitions, I think my very quick answer to that is if you look at the kind of coalitions that are reflected by what he's doing rather than what some of the things they've been saying, they tend to be making it problematic for him to push ahead with many of the economic reforms, I would say. That those sort of groups, you know, despite the corruption purges, so on and so forth, are resistant to some of the major economic restructuring and reforms. On the other two questions about Chinese perspectives, yeah, I think if you put yourself in the world inside Beijing, of course it looks very different. Language is different, perceptions are different. And if I was a leader in Beijing, I would think without certain the US is trying to encircle me and constrain me. Everything the US is doing seems to be geared to that. Now the US says it isn't, but if I was sitting in Donghai, that's certainly the way I would interpret it. And certainly a concept like Fuxing, I mean, that goes back well into Chinese history, although they often use Junxing rather than Fuxing, but it's clearly a traditional part of what China feels and that the Communist Party is able to tap into as a reassertion of the rightful place and the rightful situation that China should enjoy. I also think that there is absolutely zero reason, even if China becomes more open, it becomes more transparent and becomes more accountable, it's going to look like a European democratic state or an American democratic state. That's absolutely certain. I mean, French democracy is not the same as British democracy. I mean, we still have a queen, which is not exactly a democratic institution. And of course, Japan, again, is very different. So, and clearly, the relationship and the tendency toward kind of collectivist aspects in China is quite strong. I think the idea, you know, for myself, growing up in Europe, I don't have the kind of immediate visceral attitude towards the state and state encroachment that many of my American colleagues have. And you know, in China, I think we'll find a different balance of that relationship between individual liberties and freedoms and the role of the state and where the state can encroach, no matter what is ruling in China. So I agree with you that if you... I've always thought an interesting book to write. And many years ago, I read a couple of books. One was The World of the Political in Ancient Greece, and one was The World of the Political in Ancient Rome. And it was how people use words and categories to explain what was around them. And I think it would be really good if someone wrote that for China and explain, you know, when they use this term, they don't mean what I mean with that phrase. So I do agree with you 100% of that, but you know, I sit in America and that's kind of the way I look at it. On the last question, and I know we're running out of time, but you know, who knows what President Trump is going to do. I mean, I do think that there is an awakening in the US that is shifting from a kind of complacency about China's rise to now almost tipping to the other extreme of seeing it more as a threat, and maybe there needs to be a counteraction to that. Now that's not necessarily reflected by the president, but it's certainly reflected in the kinds of publications and the kind of things which are taking place. And I would refer you to the report written by Blackwell and Tellis, which I think is kind of where mainstream Republican thinking is going to come out. And it is much more wary about China's rise than has previously been the case. And that America shouldn't keep accepting it. America has to be clearer about what America wants and how to confront and engage China. And of course, most recently, the flavor of the month is my colleague Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, which, well, anyway, he's a colleague. How can I say this?
In 20 years.
Yeah, or even sooner. It's not great history, although I do think it's very important in certain ways, because he's really speaking to the inside the Beltway community. And it is very much a wake-up call that China's got bigger, China's got more powerful, but you guys have realized why you're sitting here. And it's about time we did something about it, that we're losing our preeminence. Now, I think he exaggerates some of the figures about China and ignores some of the challenges that China has moving forward. But I think it is a good wake-up call, and it's having waves, and that might get, over the next year or so, some of the answer to your third question about, is America going to just withdraw and say, okay, China can run RCEP, China can run One Belt, One Road, and America is going to be out. And that's where I said, one of the points I made earlier on, I see this dangerous bifurcation taking place with a sort of economic Asia with China at the core becoming stronger, and then the security Asia because of the worries of other countries in the region where the US is still at the core. And that's a very difficult balance to maintain over time, I think.
All right, the last 90 minutes or so has witnessed a very, very high caliber of intellectual debates under the aegis of, our common destination. I think the what has attracted so far the audience from this part of the world are the inevitable, and challenges created by this humongous phenomenon. Since it was sitting in this part of the world, in times of the Cold War era, now we are, witnessing another wave of, remarkable changes. And also, we are very, very appreciative for your, inputs, from your reading of this phenomenon, sharing your notes with us. And also, thirdly and finally, we're very pleased to have attract a wide, diverse audience. One can tell, all congregate in this room. Once again, let us applause for our speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for the comments and questions. It's great to be back. I've been here for 15 years or so, I expect. Yeah.
Come back more. It's lunchtime. Please